I'm too old for you, sir, the settler cook murmured, hiding a heart long resigned to solitude, until the rancher took her hand and called her his forever. But can she truly believe in love's second chance, after a lifetime of being overlooked? The sun climbed slowly over Willow Bend, spreading light across the dusty yard of the Lone Hollow Ranch. Inside the low-roofed cookhouse, Etta Wynne was already at work, sleeves rolled, apron dusted with flour. The morning smelled of coffee and cornmeal, the scent steady and familiar like the rhythm of her days. 42 years had worn her gently, not harshly. The lines on her face came from laughter once, though lately they stayed for quieter reasons. Around her, the ranch hands clattered in and out, loud and hungry boys who never seemed to run out of talk. "Smells like heaven, Miss Etta," one called, passing by with a grin. "Eat your fill, then go earn it," she replied, stirring the pot with her steady wooden spoon. Her voice carried kindness, but left no room for mischief. The men laughed and obeyed. They always did. By the time the sound of hooves echoed up the trail, Etta had set out the last of the biscuits. She looked up through the cookhouse window and froze. Graham Holt had returned. He rode with the same quiet command he always had. Broad shoulders, weathered hat pulled low, the air of a man who carried both land and loss. He dismounted slowly, patting his horse's neck, before striding toward the porch. It had been months since he'd last come home from the cattle drive. Etta felt her pulse skip, absurdly, as if she were a girl again. She busied herself with the dishes, trying to appear uninterested when he stepped through the door. "Mornin', Miss Wynne," he said, voice low as a creek after rain. "Mr. Holt," she answered without turning. "Welcome back. The men'll be glad for your company at supper." He smiled, faintly. "And what about you?" She glanced over her shoulder, caught off guard by the question. "Me? I'm just the cook, sir. Supper's my company." He stepped closer, picking up a biscuit from the tray. "Then it's lucky for me you keep such good company." Her cheeks warmed despite herself. "I'm too old for that sort of talk, sir." Graham's gaze held steady on hers. "Then it's a good thing I wasn't joking." The words landed like a pebble in still water, soft, but rippling far beyond the moment. Etta looked away quickly, pretending to scold him. "Eat before it goes cold." He obeyed, taking his plate to the long table. For a time, only the sound of his fork and the crackle of the stove filled the room. But something had shifted, subtle and real, like the first warm wind before spring. When he finished, he paused by the doorway. "You've kept this place running better than ever, Etta." "Just doing my job," she murmured, eyes on her apron. He tipped his hat. "Still, it's good to come home to more than just walls." As he walked out into the sunlight, Etta stood very still, her hand pressed to her chest, unsure whether her heart had fluttered or finally woken. If you've ever thought love had passed you by, wait until you see what happens when she looks up from her kitchen stove. The days after Graham Holt's return fell back into their rhythm, yet nothing felt quite the same. Etta Wynne noticed it in small ways: the quiet footsteps outside her cookhouse, the extra logs stacked by her back door before sunrise, the way her kitchen window always seemed freshly mended. Graham never mentioned doing any of it, but she knew his handiwork when she saw it. He'd come by each morning with some excuse. Door hinge squeaks. "Thought I'd check the stove flue. Need more coffee grounds?" Always with that slow, even voice, carrying both distance and care. Etta tried to brush it off as neighborly concern. Yet there was something deeper in the way he lingered after each errand, how his eyes searched her face like he was memorizing it, as if the simple act of being near her steadied him. At breakfast, the ranch hands teased lightly. "Boss seems mighty fond of that kitchen lately," one joked, earning laughter around the table. Etta turned from the stove, wooden spoon in hand. "He's fond of food, not gossip," she said, firm but smiling. The laughter quieted when Graham entered. He glanced around once, his presence enough to still every tongue. "Eat up," he said, sitting down. His gaze brushed past Etta's before resting on his plate. The warmth that rose in her chest surprised her more than it should have. That evening, as the others settled in for cards, Graham stayed behind in the cookhouse. Etta was kneading dough, the soft thump of her hands steady against the board. "You don't rest much," he said. "Work doesn't wait," she replied, dusting her palms. "Maybe it would if you let it." She gave a small laugh. "You sound like a man who's never run a kitchen." He smiled faintly, eyes crinkling. "No, ma'am, but I know what it means to keep something running when everything else wants to fall apart." The words struck her more deeply than she expected. She saw it then, the loneliness behind his composure, the quiet grief that hadn't faded with time. It mirrored something in her own heart, the part that believed care and comfort were enough, that love was a thing for the young or the lucky. "Mr. Holt," she said softly, "you shouldn't waste your evenings talking to an old cook. You've got a whole ranch waiting." He studied her, then shook his head. "The ranch can wait. Coffee?" Before she could answer, he poured 2 mugs and slid one across the table. The gesture was simple, yet her fingers trembled when they brushed his. Outside, the night wind sighed through the cottonwoods, carrying the faint scent of rain. Graham leaned back, quiet, content just to share the silence. Etta found herself doing the same. When he rose to leave, he tipped his hat again. "Thank you, Miss Wynne." "For what?" she asked. "For reminding me what peace sounds like." After he left, Etta stood by the door, heart unsteady. Peace, she thought, shouldn't sound like someone's voice. And yet, somehow, he did. Summer storms came hard across the sagebrush plains, rolling in with no warning. That afternoon, the air turned heavy and strange, the sky bruised with clouds that carried both beauty and threat. Etta Wynne stood by the cookhouse door, watching the horizon flicker. Thunder rumbled low, like the earth was grumbling awake. She hurried to cover the food stores, pulling canvas over barrels of grain. The men were still out driving the herd closer to the ridge, and she prayed they'd make it back before the rain hit. By the time the first drops fell, she'd barely finished shuttering the windows. Then lightning struck. The flash lit up the yard like daylight, followed by a deafening crack. Etta spun one of the outbuildings. The dry hay barn had burst into flames. Fire roared up the side before she could think twice. "Lord help me," she whispered, grabbing a bucket. She didn't stop to call for anyone. She just ran. Inside the barn, heat slammed her like a wall. The air was thick and choking, but she pushed through it, searching for what mattered most, the crates of flour and the sacks of beans that fed 24 men. She hauled what she could toward the door, coughing as smoke clawed at her lungs. "Etta!" The voice cut through the roar of the fire. "Graham Holt." Before she could answer, he appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by flame. His face was fierce, eyes burning with fear and anger both. "What in blazes are you doing in here?" "Saving what we need!" she shouted, trying to lift another sack. He crossed the floor in 2 strides, grabbed her wrist, and pulled her toward the exit. "You're not dying over dried beans." She struggled, coughing hard. "Let me—" But Graham didn't let go. His arms wrapped around her as the roof groaned and a shower of sparks rained down. He lifted her, she was small compared to him, though she'd never felt small before, and carried her out, just as the rafters fell behind them. They tumbled into the dirt, the sudden cool air a mercy. Etta gasped, lungs heaving, watching the barn collapse in on itself. Flames reached toward the storm clouds like defiant hands. "Are you hurt?" Graham asked, his hand still on her shoulder. She shook her head, hair clinging damp to her cheeks. "Just smoked a bit." He let out a breath, half relief, half fury. "Don't you ever run into a burning building again, you hear?" Etta looked up, voice trembling. "I couldn't let everything go to waste." He stared at her, jaw tight. Then, softer. "Don't you dare risk your life for beans and biscuits." The rain began to fall, then hard, hissing against the dying fire. For a long time, neither of them moved. The storm raged, the barn crackled, and still he didn't step away. Etta's pulse steadied under his touch, and for the first time in years, she realized someone cared whether she came out of a burning building alive. She met his eyes through the rain. "You didn't have to come after me." Graham's voice was quiet. "Yes, I did." And as thunder rolled across the plains, something unspoken sparked between them, brighter and more dangerous than any fire. The morning after the fire, the ranch was wrapped in a damp hush. The barn stood blackened, steaming faintly from the rain, and the scent of smoke clung to everything, the walls, the fields, even the wind itself. Etta Wynne rose before sunrise as always, but her hands shook when she lit the stove. Every time she blinked, she saw the flames again. She set 2 mugs on the table and poured coffee, one for herself, one for whoever wandered in first. She didn't expect it to be Graham Holt. He stepped through the doorway quietly, hat in hand, his shirt damp and unbuttoned at the throat. "Mornin', Miss Wynne," he said, voice rough from smoke and little sleep. "Morning, Mr. Holt," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "Coffee's fresh." He nodded, poured himself a cup, and Saturday for a time, the only sound was the slow drip of rain from the eaves. Etta busied herself with the bread dough, pretending she couldn't feel his gaze. "You saved more than you should have," he said finally. She gave a soft laugh. "You'd rather I let the food burn?" "I'd rather you didn't run into fire." His tone wasn't scolding this time, just tired, low, and laced with something that felt too much like worry. Etta turned toward him, flour dusting her apron like frost. "It's not the first storm I've come through, sir. I've been alone a long time. When things catch fire, I just put 'em out." Graham's eyes softened. "Maybe it's time someone helped." She swallowed hard. "I'm not used to being helped." "Then maybe that's the problem." He said it gently, but it landed deep. She sat opposite him, hands folded, eyes on the rising steam between them. "You've lost things too," she said quietly. "That's plain enough." He took a long breath before answering. 10 years ago, my wife, Clara, fever took her fast." "I'm sorry," Etta murmured. "She was younger than you," he continued, staring into his cup. "Full of life. I thought when she died, the world just stopped talking to me. So I buried myself in this ranch." Etta nodded, understanding more than she could say. "I did something like that too. Not with a grave, but with work. I thought, if I just kept busy, I wouldn't have to remember what being wanted felt like." Graham looked up then, his expression quiet but searching. "And does it work?" "No," she whispered, voice trembling. "It just gets lonely, quieter." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind rattled the window pane, and somewhere outside, a horse stamped restlessly. Graham set his cup down and reached across the table, rough fingers brushing hers. The contact was barely there, yet it stilled her completely. "Etta," he said softly, "maybe it's time something or someone stayed for you." Her breath caught. The words were too kind, too dangerous. She pulled her hand back slowly, eyes down. "Coffee's gone cold," she said, voice low. But even as she rose to pour another pot, her heart wouldn't settle, because for the first time in years, someone had spoken to her like she wasn't just a cook, but a woman worth staying for. By midsummer, the air over Willow Bend turned warm and gold, the kind of evening light that made even worn wood shine. The Lone Hollow Ranch had been spared the worst of the fire's loss, and work had doubled to make up for it. Still, there was laughter again, mostly because Graham Holt had declared there'd be a harvest gathering to thank the neighboring ranchers for their help. Etta Wynne had no part in the planning. Her world was the kitchen, and that was how she preferred it. The men strung lanterns across the yard while she baked pies, roasted meats, and stirred stews until the whole cookhouse smelled like comfort. She told herself she was too busy for foolish thoughts, yet her heart kept thudding every time she heard Graham's voice outside. When evening came, the yard shimmered with light. Fiddles started up, boots scuffed in the dirt, and laughter rolled out into the dark. Etta wiped her hands on her apron and stayed by the long table, watching folks twirl beneath the lantern glow. She'd never been much for dancing, hadn't been asked in over 20 years. "Miss Wynne," came that familiar baritone behind her. "It seems a shame for the woman who cooked the whole feast to stand off by herself." She turned, startled to see Graham holding out his hand. His hat was gone, silver in his hair catching the lamplight. "You ought to dance with someone who can still keep a rhythm," she said quickly. He only smiled. "I reckon I've been out of practice too. We'll stumble together." The words made her chest tighten. The nearby hands whooped good-naturedly as Graham led her into the open space. Etta's heart beat wild as he placed a steady palm against her back. The music slowed to a gentle tune, and they began to move awkwardly at first, then in an easy sway that felt far too natural. She tried to laugh. "You'll have folks talking, Mr. Holt." "Let 'em," he said, eyes never leaving hers. "I've done enough, worrying for one lifetime." For a moment, the night vanished around them. There was only the warmth of his hand, the scent of summer dust and lilac, and the strange, new flutter of being seen. Etta let herself breathe it in, just once. But joy is a fragile thing. As the song ended, she stepped back and heard two younger women near the punch bowl, whispering low, but not low enough. "Poor thing," one snickered. "Thinkin' the boss is sweet on her." "She's old enough to be his aunt," the other replied. The words sliced through Etta like a hidden thorn. She forced a smile, thanked Graham for the dance, and hurried inside before he could see the shine in her eyes. Back in the quiet kitchen, she sank onto a stool, hands trembling. The laughter outside faded, replaced by the ache of old fears, those cruel whispers she'd lived with for years. Too plain, too late, too old. She pressed her palms together and whispered into the empty room, "Don't be foolish, Etta Wynne." But when the music drifted through the door again, soft and low, she found herself crying quietly, because for one fleeting dance, she'd felt young again, and that frightened her most of all. The laughter from the harvest gathering had long since faded, but the words Etta overheard that night refused to die. They circled her mind for days, sharper than thorns. Poor thing, old enough to be his aunt. Every time she looked at Graham, those voices rose again until she could hardly meet his eyes. By the third morning, her decision was made. She packed before dawn, quietly folding her dresses and setting her cooking knives in a cloth roll. The wagon out to Mill Creek Trading Post left at sunrise, and she meant to be on it. The ranch could find another cook, someone younger, someone who didn't set tongues wagging. When she stepped out into the cool gray light, her chest hurt in a way she hadn't felt in years. The barn still smelled faintly of smoke from the fire, and the yard was silent, save for the restless stomp of horses. She'd almost made it to the gate, when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Going somewhere, Miss Wynne?" Etta froze. Graham Holt stood by the fence, coat thrown over his shoulders, eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. She hadn't heard him approach. Her throat tightened. "It's time I moved on. You don't need me here anymore." He crossed his arms, studying her face like a man staring at something precious he might lose. "That's not your reason." She looked down at her hands. "People talk. People always do." "I'm not young, Graham," she said, forcing the words out. "You deserve someone who can give you more than warm meals and conversation. Someone." "Stop." His tone was gentle, but it cut through her sentence like a clean blade. "You think I care what gossip says? You think I look at you and see anything less than the woman who kept this place alive when I couldn't?" Her eyes burned. "You're kind, but kindness doesn't change what's true." He stepped closer, boots crunching in the dirt. "You've given me more than any woman ever has. You gave me reason again. After Clara died, I thought my heart was buried with her. Then you came along quiet, steady, stubborn, and I started looking forward to mornings again." She shook her head, fighting the tremor in her chest. Don't say things you'll regret. I don't regret a word. For a long moment, neither moved. The dawn light spread slowly across the plains, turning the world gold and fragile. Then Etta lifted her chin, voice barely above a whisper. If I stay, they'll talk worse. You'll lose standing. Then let them talk, he said simply. I've spent half my life listening to the wind. I can ignore a few fools. Something inside her cracked at the quiet strength in his words. She wanted to believe him, but fear was an old habit. And old habits don't let go easily. Please, she said softly. Let me go while it still makes sense. Graham's jaw tightened, but he didn't stop her. He only said, if you're leaving, Edwin, don't expect me to stop missing you. She climbed into the wagon, heart aching with every turn of the wheel. The ranch shrank behind her. The cookhouse chimney, just a smudge in the distance. And though the road stretched ahead, all she could think of was the man standing alone in the dawn, watching her disappear. The Lone Hollow Ranch had never felt so still. Without Etta Wynn's voice humming through the cookhouse, or the smell of bread greeting dawn, the air itself seemed heavier. The men tried their best with tinned beans and burnt bacon, but it wasn't the same. Within a week, laughter around the long table faded, and the days stretched quiet as an empty field. Graham Holt noticed the silence most. He tried to keep busy mending fences, driving cattle, repairing what was left of the hay barn, but every chore reminded him of her. He'd catch himself turning toward the cookhouse to share some small thought, only to remember she wasn't there. The kettle never seemed to boil right anymore, and even the coffee tasted like dust. By the 10th day, he gave up pretending. He saddled his horse before dawn, left his foreman in charge, and rode toward Mill Creek Trading Post, 20 miles east. The sun rose behind him, casting his shadow long across the open plains. Each hoofbeat sounded like a question he didn't yet know how to answer. He found her by scent before sight, coffee and biscuits drifting from a small way station beside the post road. Through the open window, he saw Etta bent over a stove, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled. She was thinner than before, and the light in her eyes seemed dimmer, but she moved with the same steady grace he'd never forgotten. He dismounted quietly, heart hammering harder than it should have for a man his age. When she turned and saw him through the doorway, her hands stilled. For a long, fragile second, neither spoke. Mr. Holt, she said at last, voice barely steady, you shouldn't have come all this way. He removed his hat, eyes fixed on her. Couldn't eat another plate of burnt beans. Figured I'd find the woman who knows how to make coffee taste like morning again. Etta swallowed, half a laugh escaping her before she caught it. You're too used to comfort, sir. A man can learn to make do. I've done enough making, he said softly. Ranch doesn't smell right without you. Her gaze faltered. The men can manage. I wasn't talking about them. The words hung between them like sunlight through dust, warm and dangerous. She turned back to the stove, pretending to tend the pot, but her hands trembled. You don't know what folks will say if I come back. I don't care what they say. Graham stepped closer, his voice low but sure. I care that you're gone, and I'm tired of caring alone. Etta closed her eyes, torn between fear and the aching pull of hope. I left to spare you trouble. He gave a faint, sad smile. Then you made more of it. You leaving was the only mistake worth fixing. She finally looked at him, really looked, and saw the truth in his eyes. Not pity, not loneliness, but love as steady as the land itself. The kettle hissed. Outside, wind swept across the prairie, carrying the faint scent of rain. Etta set the spoon down and exhaled slowly. Graham Holt, she said, voice trembling. You never did take no for an answer, did you? He tipped his hat with a grin that reached his tired eyes. Not when the answer feels wrong. And for the first time since she'd left, Etta felt the ache in her chest ease just a little, as if home had come looking for her. Etta Wynne rode back to Lone Hollow Ranch beside Graham Holt in silence. The sky stretched wide and blue above them, the scent of sage rising from the plains. It had been weeks since she'd left, yet it felt like years. Every creak of the wagon, every familiar rise in the land stirred a strange ache in her chest, part guilt, part relief. When the ranch came into view, she nearly lost her nerve. The men paused their work to watch as Graham helped her down, their faces filled with surprise and quiet joy. No one said a word, though a few smiles spoke enough. "I can't stay long," Etta murmured, clutching her satchel. "Just until you find someone proper." Graham didn't answer. He only nodded toward the cookhouse. "The place has missed you." Inside, the air was stale, the stove cold. Dust coated the shelves where her jars once gleamed. Etta sighed, setting her things down. She ran her hand along the counter and whispered, "Looks like it forgot how to breathe." Graham leaned against the doorframe, then breathed life back into it. For the next few days, she did. The sound of chopping, stirring, and humming returned, and with it, the ranch began to feel alive again. Flowers bloomed near the porch, men lingered longer after meals, laughter returned. Etta kept her head down, pretending it was only a habit. But every evening, Graham would come by, leaning on the doorpost, watching her as though he couldn't quite believe she was real. On the fifth night, they sat on the porch together, the sky painted with sunset gold. Etta handed him a mug of coffee, her hands brushing his for just a moment. "You've been quiet these days," she said. "Been thinking," he replied. "About what?" He took a slow sip, then set the cup aside. "About how long a man should wait before he stops pretending he's just grateful." Her brow furrowed. Grateful? For the woman who turned his house back into a home. Etta's heart stuttered. "Don't, Graham." He turned to her then, eyes steady. "I'm not a young fool chasing dreams, Etta. I know what I'm saying. I thought love was something you get once and never again. But you proved me wrong." Her breath caught, words lost somewhere between fear and wonder. "You're only saying that because you've been lonely." He shook his head. "I was lonely before. Now, I'm alive." From his coat pocket, he pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a gold band, simple but worn smooth by years of memory. "It was Clara's," he said quietly. "I kept it to remember her by. But she'd want it to mean something again." He placed it gently in her palm. "Would you wear it, Etta Wynne? Not to take her place, no one could, but to walk with me through what's left of this life." Etta stared at the ring, tears gathering despite herself. "You don't want a wife this late in life," she whispered. He smiled. "I don't want a wife. I want you." The world seemed to still be around them, the wind, the rustle of the prairie, even the fading light. Etta closed her hand around the ring and looked at him through her tears. "Graham Holt," she said softly, "you are the most stubborn man west of the river. Is that a yes?" She laughed, broken and beautiful. "It's a maybe for now." And when his hand covered hers, she didn't pull away. The sun slipped below the ridge, and for the first time, the night felt like it was theirs. Morning light poured through the open windows of the Lone Hollow Ranch cookhouse, carrying with it the scent of wildflowers and fresh bread. Etta Wynne stood by the counter, smoothing the wrinkles out of her best blue dress, one she'd kept folded away for over a decade. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from disbelief. After all the years of loneliness, of convincing herself she was too old for love, today she would stand beside Graham Holt and promise him forever. The ranch buzzed with quiet excitement. The men had cleaned the yard till the dust gleamed, and one of them had fetched blooms from the river bend. A few women from town came early, filling the air with laughter and ribbon chatter. Someone strung white fabric between the cottonwoods where the ceremony would take place, the same trees where the cattle once grazed in shade. Etta glanced at her reflection in the small mirror propped by the window. The woman staring back looked softer, fuller somehow, not younger, but alive again. She touched the gold ring that hung from a ribbon around her neck, waiting to be placed on her finger proper. "Ready?" came Graham's low voice from the doorway. She turned, smiling, despite the tears threatening her composure. "You shouldn't see me before it's time." He chuckled, stepping closer anyway. "I've waited long enough. I reckon superstition can take a rest." Graham wore a clean white shirt and a new vest the men had bought in town. His hair, streaked with silver, caught the morning sunday. He looked, she thought, with a secret flutter, like a man who had found peace at last. When the guests gathered beneath the trees, the preacher stood with his Bible in hand. The cottonwoods swayed gently, the leaves whispering as though they, too, bore witness. Graham took Etta's hand as the preacher began to speak, his thumb tracing soft circles over her skin. "Marriage," the preacher said, "isn't the start of love, but the choice to keep it. These two have known loss, hard years, and long roads, but today, they choose the rest of the journey together." Etta's throat tightened as Graham slipped the ring onto her finger. His eyes never left hers. "You're my forever," he said softly, voice rough with emotion, "not my past." She smiled through tears. "And I'm too old to run any more." Laughter rippled through the crowd, but all she heard was his quiet breath, steady beside her own. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, Graham didn't rush the kiss. He lifted her hand first, kissed her knuckles, then drew her close. The kiss itself was slow, sure, tender like the first rain after drought. The ranch hands cheered, someone started playing a fiddle, and laughter rolled across the plains. Etta leaned against him, heart full, the ring warm on her hand. As the sun rose higher, the preacher closed his book and smiled. "Seems even the old cottonwoods approve," he said. Graham glanced up at the trees, then down at his wife. "They've seen a lot of seasons," he murmured, "but I reckon this one's my favorite." And with the soft breeze tugging at her veil and the sound of joy rising all around, Etta Winholt finally understood. Love didn't belong to the young. It belonged to the brave, who kept their hearts open long enough to be found again. Autumn came slow to Willow Bend, painting the plains in strokes of gold and rust. The wind softened, the cattle grazed lazily, and the days found their steady rhythm again. Only now, the Lone Hollow Ranch felt like a different place entirely. Laughter lingered where silence once sat, and the scent of baking bread carried all the way to the pastures. Inside the cookhouse, Etta Winholt worked with unhurried joy. Her apron still caught flour, her hands still kneaded dough, but the ache that once shadowed her movements had lifted. Through the open window, she could see Graham mending a gatepost, humming under his breath, a habit he'd picked up from her. When the kettle began to whistle, Etta poured 2 mugs and stepped outside. The porch had become their evening meeting place. Worn chairs side by side, a quilt draped over the rail. She handed him his cup, smiling as he set aside his hammer and wiped his brow. "The gate's near fixed," he said. "Might hold another winter if the wind stays kind." "Wind's never kind," she teased, "but we'll manage." They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun dip low over the horizon. A flock of birds crossed the sky, heading south. Etta leaned back, sighing. Hard to believe how much can change in a year. Graham nodded slowly. "A year ago, I thought I'd spend the rest of my days talking to horses and ghosts." "And now?" she asked. "Now I spend 'em talking to a woman who makes the best coffee west of the Rockies," he said with a grin. She laughed, swatting his arm. "Flattery won't get you extra pie." "Worth a try," he replied, the warmth in his eyes making her blush like a girl. Later that week, word spread of a small town gathering music, a bonfire, and stories shared before the cold set in. Etta hesitated when invited, but Graham insisted. "You cooked half the food for it," he said. "You ought to hear the songs too." That night, lanterns glowed under the wide prairie sky. The townsfolk gathered around the fire, faces bright, boots tapping to the fiddle's tune. Etta sat close to Graham, her fingers twined with his. When someone called out for her to sing, she shook her head shyly, but Graham squeezed her hand. "Go on," he whispered. "You've been quiet long enough." So she stood, voice soft at first, then clear as a bell. She sang an old frontier lullaby, one her mother used to hum while kneading bread, the same tune she'd sung in lonely kitchens for years. But tonight, it wasn't a song of sorrow. It was full of life, full of love, found late and steady. When she finished, the crowd clapped, and Graham rose to join her, his deep voice blending with hers for one last verse. The sound drifted through the fields like prayer. Later, walking home beneath the stars, Etta leaned her head against his shoulder. "You think folks will remember us, Graham?" He smiled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Maybe, but I'd rather remember us myself, every day, right here." She smiled, eyes glistening. "Then, that's enough." And as the lights of the ranch came into view, their joined hands swung easily between them, two souls in the quiet season of life, proving love doesn't fade with age. It only deepens, like the roots of the old cottonwoods by the river. If you've ever thought your story was over, wait until you see what happens when life gives you one last chapter.